Millionaire visits her father's grave, only to find a poor, single dad, Janitor, crying. There, his shoulders were pulled back, not down. That was the first thing she noticed. Grief pulls people down. This was something else. He was standing directly at her father's headstone, close enough that his boots touched the base. In his right hand, a piece of paper folded 4 times, pressed flat against his chest. Not flowers, paper. He spoke, low, just to the stone. She caught 2 words, her father's name, out of a stranger's mouth, said like an appointment kept. Roy Stanton had been running on 4 hours of sleep for 11 months. Not because he couldn't get more, because the math of his life did not permit it. Jam ended at 6. He drove home by 6:20, changed out of his uniform in the dark hallway, so the sound of the closet door wouldn't reach Miles's room, and was making oatmeal by 6:30, so that when the alarm went off at 7, breakfast was already on the table, and his son would not wake to an empty kitchen. This was not a sacrifice in the way people use that word to mean something heroic. It was just the arithmetic of raising a child alone, and Roy had gotten fluent in it, the way people get fluent in languages they did not choose to learn. The apartment on Cartwright Avenue was small, in the way that apartments are small when they are the right size for 3 people, and then one of those people is gone. Roy had not moved anything, not Dana's reading chair by the window, not the row of cookbooks she never used but liked to look at, not the small clay bowl Miles had made at school that she'd kept on the kitchen counter for holding rubber bands and twist ties, and the kind of small objects that accumulate in a household, the way sediment accumulates in a river, slowly, without anyone deciding it should happen. The bowl still held rubber bands. Roy still put things in it. He did not examine the fact that he did this. Mornings were for Miles. Roy had learned to be efficient with the parts of himself that Miles needed: steady voice, unhurried movements, the particular quality of patience that is not passive, but active. A thing you choose each time, rather than a thing that happens to you. Miles was 9, and Miles had a processing disorder that meant the alphabet reached his brain by a longer road than it reached most people's, and the longer road had its own landscape, its own logic, its own timeline that did not cooperate with school schedules or standardized testing or the assumptions of people who had never had to find a different way in. Roy had spent 3 years learning what that landscape looked like. He was still learning. Evenings were for reading. This had been Donna's thing. She had read to Miles every night since he was 4, had approached it the way she approached everything, with consistency and without ceremony, as though there were nothing unusual about sitting beside your child for 40 minutes and giving your voice to a story. After she got sick, she kept doing it. After she stopped being able to sit up on her own, Roy read instead. He was not a natural reader, aloud. He got the rhythms wrong, tripped over words, paused in places that interrupted the sense. Miles had never corrected him. He had never seemed to mind. Roy understood eventually that the reading was not about accuracy. It was about the sound of a voice in a room that still felt too quiet in all the wrong places. The night before the letter had arrived, Roy had stood in the kitchen holding the envelope from Hargrove Middle School for a full 30 seconds before he opened it. Miles was doing homework at the table, not struggling the way he used to struggle. Something had shifted in the last year. Some internal arrangement had been made between Miles and the written word that Roy could not entirely explain, and Roy turned his back slightly to open the envelope because he did not want his face to be visible when he read it. He read it. He read it again. Then he put both hands flat on the counter and breathed through his nose for a moment. Miles did not look up. Later, after Miles was in bed, Roy sat at the kitchen table with the letter in front of him and thought about the people he wanted to tell. The list was shorter than it should have been for a man his age, and the person at the top of it was not reachable by phone. He folded the letter into quarters and put it in his uniform pocket. He worked his shift. At 6 in the morning, instead of going home, he drove to Maplewood. Walter Crane had died on a Thursday in October 3 years ago. Sloan had been in a meeting when her phone rang her father's doctor, which was unusual enough that she stepped out immediately, and she had driven to the hospital in a state that was not panic, but was the thing adjacent to panic when a person has been trained so thoroughly against it that the machinery of panic runs without the recognizable symptoms. By the time she arrived, it was over. Her father had been 71, had been healthy by any measure that a person could apply, without knowing what was happening inside the specific blood vessel that had given out, and he had been dead for 22 minutes. She had not cried at the hospital. She had not cried at the funeral 3 days later, which she had organized with the same methodical attention she brought to quarterly reviews, working through the checklist of flowers and readings and receptions, with the understanding that this was something that needed to be done correctly, and that done correctly was the best thing she could offer in the absence of knowing what else to do. The eulogy had been 7 minutes. She had written it herself. She had talked about his precision, his reliability, the particular quality of his confidence, not arrogant, just settled the confidence of a man who had decided what he believed and lived by it without requiring validation. She had talked about the company he had built, the values he had instilled, the way he had taught her that a decision made slowly is worth more than 3 decisions made quickly. She had meant every word of it. She had believed it was complete. That was before the garage. That was before the tack card. That was before a stranger started crying in front of his headstone on a gray morning in November, and she walked toward him and heard her father's name spoken like a debt that had come due. She was 10 feet away when he heard the gravel under her heels and turned. He was younger than she had expected, mid-30s, a jaw that needed shaving eyes, that were red at the rims and steady in the center, the eyes of someone who has been crying but is not undone by it. He wore a gray maintenance uniform with a name stitched above the chest pocket, Roy. He looked at her, and something passed across his face that was not guilt. It was recognition which made no sense. And then she understood that he had recognized her from something news coverage, a photograph somewhere, and the recognition had told him who she was before she could decide how to introduce herself. "This is a private burial," she said. The words came out flatter than she intended, more like a policy statement than a thing one human says to another. "I think you may have the wrong grave." He looked at the headstone, then back at her. "Walter Arthur Crane," he said. "Born 1952. Died 3 years ago, October." The accuracy of it stopped her. "How do you know that name, Will?" "I knew him." He said it simply, the way you say something true that you have no reason to embellish. He was still holding the folded paper against his chest, and she noticed he had not moved from his position in front of the stone, had not stepped back to make room for her or to signal deference. He was not aggressive. He simply seemed to believe he had as much right to be standing where he was standing as she did, and he was going to let that belief hold until someone gave him a reason to revise it. He didn't know maintenance workers, Sloan said, and heard herself say it, and heard what it sounded like. Roy looked at her for a moment. Whatever he was thinking, he kept it contained. "He read books with my son," he said, "every Saturday morning for 2 years." The wind came through the east corridor. Somewhere in the west section, a car door closed. Sloan thought about her father on Saturday mornings. He had played golf. He had come home tired and said golf was harder than he remembered, and then laughed at himself, the way he laughed at things that were not particularly funny, but that he found worth acknowledging. She had not questioned it. Why would she have questioned it? Golf was something her father had always done. "What do you mean he read books with your son?" she said. "My son has a language processing disorder," Roy said. "Reading is harder for him than for most kids. His mother's gone. It was a difficult stretch. Someone told us about a Saturday literacy program at Eastside Collective. A volunteer there worked with him. Every week. Same time, same chair, same method. He'd read a passage out loud first, and then Miles would read it back. He said rhythm was more important than accuracy. He paused, not for effect, just to find the next words. My son started reading. Actually reading. Not at grade level yet, but differently. Like something that used to be locked, got unlocked. He turned the folded paper over in his hand once. Yesterday he got into Hargrove Middle School. They have a learning support program. He'll have what he needs. Something shifted in his voice, not breaking, just shifting the way a note shifts key. I needed somewhere to say it out loud. The man who sat with my son every Saturday, I found out his name after he was gone. I drove by this place 3 times before I came in. Sloane stood very still. Not from composure, from the effort of processing something that was rearranging other things. Her father had never mentioned a Saturday literacy program. He had never mentioned a child named Miles. He had never said anything, not in passing, not in the years she had seen him regularly for dinners and board meetings and the Sunday calls they had maintained without much discussion because it was the kind of family rhythm they had fallen into and kept without examining. He had talked about the company, about his garden, about the books he was reading. He had talked about her decisions, her challenges, the strategies she was considering. He had never said, I've been sitting in a plastic chair on Saturday mornings next to a child who has trouble with letters, and it matters to me more than I can explain. He didn't tell you, Roy said. It was not a question. No. Roy nodded once, slowly. He set the folded letter against the base of the headstone, propped against the stone, so it would not blow away. A careful gesture, deliberate, like leaving something where the right person would find it. Then he put his hands in his pockets and looked at the headstone for a long moment. He never told us his last name either, he said. Just Walter. Just someone who came on Saturdays. He exhaled. I found out who he was when I saw his photograph in a magazine in a waiting room. Business section. I sat there for a while. He looked at her. He treated my son like his time was worth nothing compared to an hour with a kid who needed someone to sit with him. That's not how most people act when they have what he had. Sloane did not answer. She was looking at the letter propped against the stone. A piece of paper folded 4 times by a man who had driven to a cemetery before going home from a night shift because he needed somewhere to say thank you out loud, and there was only one person he wanted to say it to. I'm sorry, Roy said, for your loss. I know that's late. He gave a small nod, the kind that closes a thing without demanding anything. Then he walked back down the gravel path. She stood in front of the stone a long time after his footsteps faded. The garage was attached to the house she had grown up in and had not yet decided what to do with. She drove there that afternoon without planning, to the way you sometimes drive somewhere when your hands know before your mind does. She let herself in through the side door and stood in the gray concrete air for a moment. And then she looked at the corner where her father had kept his golf clubs since she was 12 years old. The dust on the bag was not the dust of a week or a month. It was layered, settled, the kind that accumulates over years of something sitting untouched. She found a dry cloth and drew a line through it. The line was clear and white beneath. She stood there with a dusty cloth in her hand and counted backward. The last time her father had mentioned golf, seriously played a full round, come home with that specific outdoor tiredness, 7 years ago, maybe 8. She had assumed he had gradually lost interest. People did. He had never said he'd stopped. She had never thought to ask. Every Saturday morning for 2 years, she put the cloth down and went inside into the study where his desk still sat, with its leather surface and its lamp and the framed photographs he had kept there. Not trophies, not achievements, just images he had wanted nearby while he worked. She and her mother at a beach somewhere, her parents on their wedding day, a mountain range she didn't recognize from a trip he had taken before she was born. The desk drawers were still full. She had gone through some of them after he died. pulled out what the attorney had needed, and then stopped because it was a Saturday, and she had calls Monday, and the rest could wait. It had waited 3 years. She went through them now methodically, until in the second drawer from the bottom, she found a small wallet he had used for years before switching to a newer one. Inside, behind the expired cards and the folded receipts, was a tack card. The kind you get at a front desk. Eastside Literacy Collective. Address, hours. Saturday 9 to 11 a.m. The corner was bent over, softened from being folded and unfolded. The kind of wear that accumulates when you take something out of your pocket to look at it regularly, to check an address you have already memorized, because looking at it is a small act of intention towards something you care about. She sat at his desk with the card in her hand for a long time. She went to Eastside Literacy on the following Saturday. She did not call ahead. She pushed the door open at 9:15 and found a large, bright room with low tables and mismatched chairs and the specific quality of quiet that happens when a group of people are concentrating. At the front, a woman in her 50s was sorting books with the efficiency of someone who has sorted books for a very long time. "Can I help you?" The woman looked up. Open face, steady eyes. "I think my father volunteered here," Sloane said. She had not decided how to begin before she walked through the door. This was unusual for her. "Walter Crane. I found your address in his things." The woman Deb, according to the lanyard, went very still. Then something in her expression settled. "Sit down," she said. "I'll make tea." The tea was strong and arrived in a mug with a chip in the handle. Deb sat across from her and talked about Walter Crane, the way people talk about someone who left a specific shape in the world, not the shape of importance or influence, but the shape of presence. He came early. He stayed late. He sat at the table in the back corner because the light was good there and it was quiet, and the children who worked with him tended to do better with quiet. He never discussed his life outside the room. He asked questions about the children, their interests, what they liked to eat, what scared them, what made them laugh, and he used those things as material. If a boy loved basketball, Walter found stories about basketball. If a girl loved horses, there were horse books. He adapted without being asked to adapt, which Deb said was rarer than it should have been among volunteers. He never talked about why he did it, Sloane asked. "Once," Deb said, "I asked him because he kept coming back during a stretch when we had a lot of turnover. I thought maybe he'd explain it the way some people do retirement, giving back that kind of framing." She paused. He said he'd been lucky his whole life, and the luck embarrassed him sometimes when he thought about it too carefully. He said doing this was the only antidote he'd found. She looked at Sloane. He didn't say it like a philosophy. He said it like a grocery list, just a fact he'd arrived at. Sloane looked out the window at the street. Traffic moved along it in the ordinary way. A man walked a dog. A bus stopped and opened its doors. Deb went to the back and returned with a piece of paper, a photocopy soft from handling. A child's drawing on one side, and on the other, in uneven printing a poem. The title was "Ong Walter," misspelled the way a child spells a word they have only heard spoken. 6 lines about a man who sat beside you and read out loud before letting you try, because starting with someone else's voice made the words less frightening. The last line read, "He says, 'Rhythm is more important than right. I am practicing my rhythm.'" Sloane read it twice. She folded it carefully and put it in her coat pocket. Deb did not ask for it back. She called Roy through the contact number for Maplewood Cemetery's maintenance staff. She gave her name to the person who answered and asked them to pass along that she would like to speak with him when he had time. She did not expect him to call back quickly because she had given him no real reason to. He called back that evening. "I went to Eastside," she said. "I met Deb. She showed me the attendance board. 97 Saturdays. He didn't miss many," Roy said. "He told my family he was playing golf." A pause. Why do you think he did that? Because he didn't want us to ask about it, she said. He didn't want it to become a conversation. He wanted it to be just Saturday mornings. Roy was quiet for a moment. He asked me once if I had anyone to tell good news to. I didn't understand the question at the time. I thought he meant friends. Another pause. I think I understand it better now. She sat with that. Outside her window, the city continued at its usual volume, indifferent to what was being understood at the back table of her life. Can I ask you something I don't know the answer to? She said. Sure. Can you tell me about one specific Saturday? Not generally one day that you remember. Something he did that stayed with you? Roy was quiet long enough that she thought she might have asked something he didn't want to answer. Then he said, "One time Miles finished a paragraph and looked up at your father and asked him if he really understood what Miles was saying. Just straight out asked him, like he'd been saving the question." A breath. Your father stopped everything, just looked at Miles for a long time. Then he said, "That's the best question anyone's asked me in years." And he meant it. You could tell he meant it. Roy paused. After that, Miles stopped being afraid to ask things he wasn't sure about. Something shifted. Sloane sat in the quiet of her living room. Her father had said to her, more times than she could count, "You ask better questions than most people." She had taken it as encouragement, as the thing a father says to a daughter he loves. She understood now that he had been practicing it, that somewhere on Saturday mornings, he had been learning to receive that kind of honesty, and what he'd learned he had brought home and given to her without explaining where it had come from. She had thought she knew her father completely because they had been close. She understood now that close and complete were not the same measurement. "Thank you," she said. "He would have said not to tell him," Roy said. "I know. I'm telling you because you already knew him." It was the truest thing she had said to another person in longer than she could calculate. The glass cabinet in her office had stood in the same configuration for 6 years. Awards, press photographs, the kind of professional documentation that accumulates when you spend 15 years building something that other people can see and measure. She had never questioned the arrangement. It had made sense as an expression of who she was in this room. She went to her desk drawer, where she kept a few personal items, a key to her mother's old house, a pen that had belonged to her grandmother, a photograph in a sleeve. The photograph was from her 16th birthday. She and her father were in the kitchen, both reaching for the same cheese knife, both laughing in the slightly blurred way of people who have been caught mid-motion by someone who pressed the shutter at the right moment. Her mother had taken it. She had found it years ago in an old album and put it in her desk because she hadn't known what else to do with it. She opened the cabinet and moved one award 6 inches to the left, set the photograph where the space opened, stepped back. The cabinet looked different in a way that was difficult to articulate. Not better, exactly. More accurate. She stood in front of it for a while. Then she picked up her phone and called her assistant, Dana, who had been trying to move into project management for 2 years, and who Sloane had been aware of only in the peripheral way of someone who noticed the performance of a current role without asking what else that person was capable of. She made 2 calls. By end of week, Dana had a transition plan with a start date. It was a small thing. Sloane knew it was small. She was beginning to understand that her father had probably known each individual thing was small too, and had done them anyway, one at a time, without waiting for the sum to feel large enough to justify the parts. The following Saturday, she drove past East Side Literacy at 9 in the morning. She did not stop. She pulled over across the street and looked at the lit window from inside her car. Through the glass, she could see a table, and at the table, a person sitting beside a child, pointing at something on a page. She did not know who they were. She did not need to. She sat there watching the window for a while, the heater running low, the street quiet in the way that city streets are quiet on Saturday mornings, before the day decides to become itself. Her father had looked at this window every week for 2 years. He had parked somewhere nearby, walked in, sat down, and given 2 hours to something that would leave no record, earn no acknowledgement, generate no return, except the thing that Roy had described, the unlocking of something that had been locked in a child who had needed someone to sit beside him and not require perfection. Her father had never said, "I am doing something meaningful." He had just kept his calendar clear on Saturday mornings and not explained why. She sat in the car until her phone buzzed with something that needed her attention. Then she got out, crossed the street, walked into East Side Literacy, and signed up as a volunteer. She wrote her first name only in the space provided. Deb looked at the form, looked at her, and put the form in the drawer without a word. The following year, on the same date, Sloane drove to Maplewood with a bundle of flowers she had picked up from the shop near her building. Nothing expensive. Something seasonal wrapped in brown paper, bought without deliberation. She had pointed at them and paid and walked out. She had not spent time choosing. She had just let it be what it was. She turned onto the east path, and Roy was already there. Miles was beside him, one hand in his father's, the other holding a piece of folded paper that was too small to be the Hargrove letter. Something he had written. Roy was standing a few feet back from the headstone, this time not pressed close the way he had been the first morning she had found him here. He had his flowers too wrapped in paper, not plastic, a small upgrade that she noticed and said nothing about. He heard her footsteps on the gravel and turned, and neither of them registered surprise. They stood together in front of the stone. Sloane set her flowers at the base. Roy set his beside them. The two bundles touched at the edges, without anyone arranging them that way. Miles read a story to his class last month, Roy said to the stone more than to her. Chose it himself. Stood up in front of everybody. His teacher sent me a video. He was quiet for a moment. I watched it about 15 times. Good, Sloane said. He paused in the wrong places, Roy said. But he didn't rush. He kept his own rhythm. Miles had been watching them talk with the focused quiet of a child who is absorbing more than he appears to be. He looked at the headstone. He looked at Sloane. But told me about the man who's buried here, he said. He sat next to me and read out loud before I read, so I could hear the shape of it first. I know, Sloane said. He told me that too, when I was young. Miles considered this. He reached into his pocket and took out the folded paper, a short piece of writing, 4 or 5 lines, the letters still not perfectly formed, but deliberate, each one placed with care. He stepped forward and set it at the base of the headstone beside the flowers. Then he stepped back. Boss says he didn't do it for anyone to know, Miles said. That's right, Roy said. Miles looked at the stone. But we know. He said it simply without sentiment, the way a person states a fact they find important. Does that change it? Nobody answered. The wind moved through the oaks that lined the east corridor, a low sound without urgency. Somewhere in the west section, a bird made 3 calls and stopped. The 3 bunches of flowers and the folded paper rested together at the foot of the headstone, touching without anyone having arranged them to touch, which was its own kind of answer. Sloane stood in the thin winter light with Roy beside her and the boy in front of her, and she carried what she had come to carry. Not grief exactly. Not any more, but the fuller weight of a person more complete than she had known a man who had taught her about rhythm and then gone somewhere else to practice it, who had believed that the right thing did not require an audience to be worth doing, and who had been correct about that in ways she was only beginning to measure. She was not the person who had walked into this cemetery the year before. She was not finished changing. But she was here, and she was present in the way she had been learning to be present, not for the record, not for the room, just because it was the only honest way to stand in a place that asks something real of you. Miles reached down and straightened one of the flower bundles that had leaned sideways in the wind. A small adjustment, careful the way you handle something that belongs to a moment and deserves to be kept in it. Nobody told him to do that. He just did.